They told her she didn't belong here, not because of her ticket, not because of her behavior, but because of how she looked. On this flight, a 13-year-old black girl sat quietly in a seat she paid for, only to be humiliated, degraded, and dragged through hours of cruelty she never saw coming. But what no one on that plane knew was that the smallest voice would trigger the loudest reckoning they'd ever witness. Before this flight lands, careers will collapse, reputations will burn, and justice will punch through 30,000 feet of silence. This is not just a story. This is a warning. If you believe that dignity shouldn't depend on skin color, like this video. If you think silence enables injustice, subscribe to this channel. And if you've ever seen or experienced anything like this, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? This isn't just her story, it's all of ours. Let's begin. Zara Bennett stepped into the first-class cabin with quiet excitement tightening in her chest. Her 12-year-old frame wrapped in a navy blue jacket that hung slightly off her shoulders, her shoes neatly polished, her braids freshly done for the trip. Her backpack, compact and clean, bounced gently on her back as she scanned the seats, reading the printed numbers with care until she spotted it. 2A. Her ticket had said it clearly. Her father had booked it weeks ago, down to the precise placement by the window because she liked to watch the clouds. She reached up to place her small carry-on into the overhead bin, adjusting it carefully, trying to make sure it didn't take too much space. That's when she heard the first voice, sharp, condescending, already aimed directly at her presence. "Excuse me," said the flight attendant, her name tag gleaming, "Claudia. Are you lost, sweetheart?" Zara turned politely, blinking once as she registered the tone. "No, ma'am. I'm in 2. She held up her boarding pass. Claudia didn't take it. She glanced at Zara instead, from her sneakers to her smooth dark skin to her careful posture. "This is first class," Claudia said slowly, as if explaining gravity. Zara nodded. "Yes, my dad, he got me this seat." Still, Claudia didn't move. Her gaze hardened. "And where is your father?" she asked, adding a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Zara hesitated. "He's not here. He dropped me off. I'm traveling alone." Claudia's lips parted slightly, the smile vanishing. "Alone? In first class?" She let the words linger, as if Zara had just confessed to a crime. "I don't think so." Zara lifted the boarding pass higher, both hands holding it now. "I really am seat 2A, she said, voice gentle, uncertain. Claudia took the pass this time, snatching it quickly, scanning it without care. Her expression didn't soften. "It says first class," she muttered, and then louder. "Well, that's interesting." Zara's heart pounded a little harder. Claudia turned to another crew member and raised her voice enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Can we get someone from the gate to double-check this ticket? I think we've got a seat mismatch here." Zara's cheeks flushed as she turned to see the other passengers looking up, curious. One woman pursed her lips. A man arched a brow and leaned toward his companion to whisper something. Zara stepped back from the row. Claudia hadn't handed her boarding pass back. "I promise it's mine," Zara said, quieter now, shrinking. Claudia looked at her again, this time with open disapproval. "Look," she said, crouching slightly, as if addressing a toddler. "This cabin is for full-fare passengers. You can't just walk into first class and hope no one notices." "I didn't walk in," Zara whispered. "I boarded with the rest of the passengers." Claudia sighed and stood straight again. "We'll sort it out in a moment. In the meantime, please step aside and let real passengers board." Her words sliced through the row like a whip. A couple nearby snickered. Another passenger rolled their eyes. Zara stepped backward, bumping gently into the row behind her, her face burning. Her fingers clenched her jacket hem tightly. "But it's my seat," she said again, softer, more to herself than anyone else. Claudia ignored her. She turned toward the incoming passengers and began greeting them with a new voice, brighter, more polished. "Welcome aboard," she beamed at a man in a business suit. "To see, right this way. Champagne after takeoff." Zara looked down at her shoes. They were clean, but not shiny like the man's. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, her breath short, her mouth dry. Behind her, someone said, "They just let anyone in here now, huh?" And the words hit like a slap. The boarding process continued. Zara stood still. The entire time, no one offered her the seat. No one questioned why a child was being blocked from her place. A few stared. A few looked away. None spoke. After several minutes, Claudia circled back, holding the boarding pass between two fingers as if it were a used tissue. "Okay," she said, "so apparently this ticket is valid. But next time, you should let us seat priority passengers first. It's called etiquette." Zara's mouth opened slightly, then closed. She didn't know what to say. Claudia gestured toward 2A, finally stepping aside. "You may go to your seat," she said flatly, then added, "but please don't touch the premium service items until we're airborne." Zara nodded quickly and slipped past her. She sank into the seat, trying to disappear into the leather, her small fingers tracing the edge of the armrest like it might anchor her to the ground. Around her, passengers continued settling in. Some glanced at her with lingering suspicion, others with quiet pity, none with warmth. A minute later, Claudia walked by again, glanced down, and frowned. "Don't put your bag there," she snapped. "Stow it properly, or we'll have to move it." Zara jolted, reached down, and stuffed her backpack under the seat. Claudia didn't thank her. She didn't speak again. She moved on. Zara leaned her head toward the window and stared out at the tarmac, willing the plane to take off, willing the sky to swallow her, willing something, anything, to prove she was supposed to be here. But nothing came. Zara stood in silence as Claudia's voice sliced through the ambient hum of the cabin, loud and pointed, cutting straight to the bone. "We have an unauthorized passenger in first class," she announced, her tone theatrical and shrill. "Can someone call security?" The murmur of conversations halted. Heads turned. Laptops were lowered. Coffee cups froze midair. The attention of the entire cabin, a mix of tailored suits and designer perfume, pivoted toward a 13-year-old black girl standing beside seat 2A with her small, neatly packed backpack still on her shoulders. Zara's face flushed not with guilt, but with shame, an involuntary heat rising from being exposed and humiliated in front of people who were supposed to be adults. "I'm not unauthorized," she tried to say, voice soft and cracking. "I have a ticket. This is my seat." Claudia ignored her completely and turned toward her fellow crew. "I need confirmation," she snapped. "Is this girl even listed in the manifest?" Her colleague, visibly nervous, hesitated. "It says she's booked in first class." Claudia scoffed, her voice rising again for everyone to hear. "Well, clearly there's been a mistake. This is why we don't rely on auto upgrades." Laughter scattered lightly from a few rows back, not loud, but loud enough. Zara blinked rapidly, trying to stay composed, standing frozen like a statue in front of 30 seated strangers. One woman whispered, "Where are her parents?" Another said, "This is getting uncomfortable." Claudia wasn't finished. She turned back to Zara with a smug smile and a raised eyebrow. "Are you thirsty, sweetheart?" she asked in a tone coated with venomous mockery. Zara, already trembling, nodded timidly. "Yes, please. May I have some orange juice?" Claudia's eyes gleamed with something cruel. She turned to the cart, took a tall plastic cup filled with chilled orange juice, and walked back. Then, without warning, she threw the entire cup directly at Zara. The cold liquid splashed across the girl's chest and face, soaking her sweater, drenching her collar, and dripping down onto her shoes and the pristine cabin floor. A collective gasp erupted from the nearby seats. "There," Claudia hissed. "You wanted orange juice? Drink up." For a moment, no one moved. The horror was palpable. One man began to rise from his seat, but his wife tugged him back down by the sleeve. "Don't get involved," she whispered. Zara stood frozen, the juice dripping off her chin, her glasses spotted with pulp and sugar. Her hands didn't move. Her body didn't move. Her breath came out in short, shallow bursts, but her eyes remained locked on Claudia with a look that held no hate, only disbelief. Claudia smiled wider. "Clean that up before someone slips," she said, tossing a napkin at Zara's feet. "And don't say I never served you." Someone from the middle rows muttered, "Jesus Christ," under their breath. A younger flight attendant hovered near Claudia, horrified. "Should we call someone?" she whispered. Claudia snapped. She brought this on herself. No manners. No respect. You give an inch, they take the aisle. Zara slowly dropped her bag and reached for the napkin. She crouched, knees shaking, hands trembling as she dabbed at the carpet with a tiny square of paper that dissolved instantly in the juice. A few rows back, a woman discreetly pulled out her phone and began recording. A man near the window looked away, ashamed to be watching. No one moved to help her. Claudia folded her arms and turned to the rest of the cabin with a performative sigh. "Sorry for the delay, folks. Some people need to be reminded that first class has standards." Her voice was syrupy again, back in professional mode. "We'll resume beverage service shortly." She glanced down at Zara again. "Unless you'd like seconds?" The cup she had thrown clattered down the aisle as the plane shifted gently. Zara rose slowly, not making eye contact, shoulders soaked and trembling. She stood like a statue carved from quiet pain, her chest rising and falling as she bit down on her lower lip to keep it from trembling. She made no sound. She did not wipe her face. She did not ask for help. She did not scream. But in her eyes, something had shifted. She sat back down in two-way, dripping with juice and surrounded by silence. Claudia leaned over and whispered into her ear, "Don't get too comfortable. You'll be gone soon." Then she walked away. Her body had entered a quiet shutdown, the kind that children experience not when they're fighting, but when they've stopped believing they can. Claudia's heels tapped back toward her with rhythm and purpose, a smirk playing on her lips as she stopped beside the soaked child. "Get up," she ordered flatly. Zara didn't move, not out of defiance, but because she couldn't. Her limbs were stiff, heavy, her arms barely able to respond. Her mind screamed to obey, to flee the spotlight, to disappear, but her muscles refused. Claudia leaned in, her breath hot and close. "Don't make me repeat myself. This seat isn't yours." Zara finally managed to blink. "But she started, the word barely audible, her voice smaller than a whisper. "What was that?" Claudia barked louder, then turned to the cabin again. "Refusing to comply," she announced, and occupying a restricted seat. Her voice had grown theatrical, like she was performing for the passengers, building her case in real time. A few gasps floated through the air. A woman across the aisle raised her phone again, pointing the lens discreetly at the scene. "You heard me," Claudia said again, grabbing Zara's forearm. The girl flinched instinctively, but her resistance wasn't strength, it was fear. Her shoes slid slightly on the floor as Claudia yanked her upright. "Let's go," the woman snapped, dragging her out into the aisle with mechanical efficiency. Zara stumbled, her balance off from the soaked jeans clinging to her knees, her right shoe half off from the sudden pull. She didn't protest. She didn't ask questions. She simply followed the force pulling her forward, head bowed, eyes unfocused, her mind floating somewhere just above the fluorescent lights. "Where are you taking her?" a man asked suddenly from row 2C, half rising. Claudia didn't miss a beat. "Back where she belongs," she said icily. "You want to join her?" The man froze. His mouth opened, then shut. He sat. The message was clear. Zara's shoulders sagged as Claudia gripped the girl's thin arm with her manicured fingers and marched her down the aisle. A few passengers looked away. Others watched with veiled interest, like spectators of a silent tragedy, unsure whether they were allowed to feel sympathy or if it might cost them their comfort. "Keep moving," Claudia muttered under her breath. "This little show is almost over." Zara's legs moved on autopilot, half-dragged, half-walking. Her right sock now stained orange and wet as her shoe slipped off completely somewhere near row 8. She didn't stop to get it. Claudia didn't let her. "There," Claudia said finally, stopping at the very last row. "Sit." Zara obeyed. She folded into the narrow seat like a bird tucking its wings, her knees pressed to the tray, her soaked sweater cold against her skin. Claudia reached up and slammed the overhead bin shut, then added one final line before walking away. "Next time, buy the right ticket, before you pretend to be somebody." Then she was gone, just like that. The curtain dividing the cabin fell back into place behind her, literally and metaphorically closing Zara out from the space where she had belonged only moments ago. The hum of the engines grew louder in her ears, or perhaps her mind was finally allowing her to hear them now that the shouting had stopped. Her fingers trembled in her lap. Her left arm throbbed from where it had been yanked. Her jaw clenched from the effort of staying still. She wasn't being brave, she was being broken in real time, and no one seemed to notice. A junior attendant passed by and paused. Her name tag read Grace. She opened her mouth like she might say something, but when she glanced up toward first class, her words died in her throat. Instead, she offered a napkin. Just one. Zara accepted it and began wiping her face, not because she wanted to, but because it was something to do. Her mind was still catching up to her body, still trying to process the humiliation, the touch, the orange juice, the whispers, the camera phone, the eyes, the hands that had forced her from her seat like she was an object in someone else's way. No one told her what to do now. No one offered a blanket or a drink. She sat there barefoot, soaked, burning, the cold air of the cabin crawling under her skin like a second punishment. The tray in front of her had a water ring from the last passenger. She stared at it. It didn't move. Nothing did. In first class, Claudia resumed her duties, her voice now sweet and professional, as she handed out hot towels to the new occupant of seat 2A. She laughed softly, complimented a passenger's tie, poured champagne. From the back row, Zara could still hear her. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to make it all go away, but the sound found her anyway, each note of Claudia's manufactured charm dragging a fresh cut through her chest. She hadn't fought because she hadn't known how. The silence around her was loud, filled with judgment and absence, a void where comfort, safety, and kindness should have been. She hadn't moved since Claudia dragged her down the aisle. Her right foot was still bare. Her backpack, now shoved under the seat, was slightly open, revealing a math workbook and a half-eaten granola bar. She didn't care. She couldn't. Her mind was still replaying the moment she was pulled away like an object, her voice stripped from her throat by the shame of being paraded through rows of passengers too polite to protest. The airplane rumbled as it ascended, the chime for electronic devices being allowed pinged, and around her, passengers began to lean back, watch movies, adjust blankets, and sip drinks. The seat beside Zara remained empty. Grace, the younger attendant, passed by with a tray of hot towels, her eyes flicking toward Zara but never stopping. Claudia, however, did stop. She stepped into the aisle like a judge returning to the courtroom, her lips curled with condescension. In her hand, she carried a neatly folded fleece blanket, soft and pristine, the kind handed out in first class. She paused at Zara's row, looked down at the girl huddled under one that had already been there when she sat. Without warning, Claudia reached down, gripped the edge of Zara's blanket, and yanked it clean off her lap. "This isn't yours," she said sharply, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This is for VIP guests." Zara gasped softly, startled by the sudden exposure. Her arms instinctively tried to pull the blanket back, but Claudia had already stuffed it under her own arm and stepped back. "You'll have to make do with economy rations," she added, her voice dipped in mock kindness. Zara looked up at her with wide, stunned eyes. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the engines. "Exactly," Claudia snapped. "That's the problem." She turned and walked away, carrying the blanket like a trophy, her heels clicking crisply with every step. 2 rows ahead, a teenage girl lifted her phone and began to record discreetly. On her screen, Zara sat in the cold, arms locked around herself, her small frame visibly shaking. A tear slipped from Zara's eye, not the first, but the one she could no longer hide. Her mouth trembled as she bit her lip hard enough to leave a mark, doing everything she could not to cry audibly. Claudia returned 15 minutes later with a tray of headphones, walking row by row. When she reached Zara, she paused, looked down, and said, "No headphones for standby passengers." Zara's head tilted up slightly, confused. But she stopped. She hadn't said anything wrong. She hadn't asked. She simply existed. "Entertainment devices are for verified premium flyers," Claudia said, placing 2 pairs on the armrests of the people in the row ahead. not for those flying at the mercy of upgrades or charity. Zara lowered her eyes again, retreating back into herself. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. A man across the aisle shifted in his seat, watching the interaction with a frown. But like the others, he said nothing. No one did. Claudia knew that, and she used it. "And don't press the call button again unless it's an emergency," she added before moving on. "This isn't a daycare." The air around Zara seemed to shrink. The cabin noise faded into static. The muffled laughter from the row ahead, the hum of engines, the clink of cutlery in first class. It all blurred into one distant wave of cruelty. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. Hunger was nothing compared to the fire spreading in her chest, the kind that couldn't be soothed with food or blankets. It was the ache of not being seen, not being believed, not being defended. Claudia returned one final time that hour to distribute water bottles. When she reached Zara, she offered her a warm plastic cup, not sealed, not cold. Just warm water in a lidless cup. Zara took it with both hands, trying to smile faintly as a reflex. Claudia didn't smile back. "Don't spill this one," she said, then moved on without waiting for a reply. The girl in the row behind Zara caught the whole exchange on camera. She whispered to her mother beside her, who nodded gravely. They both looked forward, but said nothing aloud. Zara sipped the water slowly, hands trembling so badly she had to use both to steady it. She tasted salt with the water, unsure if it came from the plastic or her own tears. Her nose was running now, her cheeks blotchy. She leaned her head against the cool plastic wall of a plane, staring out into nothing. She thought of the dinner waiting at home, of her dad's voice on the phone saying, "Can't wait to see you." She thought of the dress she packed for the welcome party, the one she wouldn't wear now. The plane felt endless. The row felt like a cell. Her voice non-existent. Every few minutes, someone would walk by and glance, but their eyes would flick away just as fast, as if looking too long might make them complicit. And Claudia? She was still smiling, still laughing, still offering champagne to other passengers, joking with the man in Zara's old seat like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just taken a 13-year-old girl and taught her that silence is safer than truth. The warmth from the orange juice had long faded, replaced by the cold sting of drying sugar against her clothes. Her right sock was still damp, her hair stuck to the side of her face. Her lips quivered, not from tears, but from pure, quiet shock. She reached for the napkin tucked under the edge of her tray table, not to cry into it, not even to hide, but simply to clean her face, to do something, anything, that might make her feel like a person again. The napkin was thin and already tearing at the edges, but she pressed it gently under her eye, wiping away the wetness that clung to her skin. Just as she brought it down to dab her chin, a shadow fell across her row. Claudia stood there, arms crossed, a smirk barely hidden beneath her polished facade. "Crying already?" she said loud enough for the row ahead to hear. "I thought you were tougher than that." Zara looked up, startled, her hand still holding the napkin. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her silence, her smallness, her damp clothes and red-rimmed eyes said it all. Claudia leaned forward without warning, snatched the napkin from Zara's fingers, and crumpled it in her fist. Zara flinched. Claudia's voice dropped an octave, mocking, venomous. "First class isn't a place for little girls to cry and beg for pity." She uncrumpled the napkin, looked at it with theatrical disgust, then balled it again and threw it directly at Zara's chest. It bounced off and landed in her lap. "Clean up somewhere else," Claudia hissed. Zara stared at the napkin, sitting like an accusation in her lap. She didn't move. The humiliation ran too deep now. Her face burned. Her eyes stung. Her fingers clenched against the tray. Claudia wasn't finished. She turned back toward the galley, returned moments later with a full meal tray, glazed chicken, steamed vegetables, warm roll, butter dish, a cloth napkin, and a small slice of pie, clearly a premium meal. She stood over Zara, holding the tray at shoulder height, eyes scanning the girl like a judge about to issue a sentence. Zara blinked, unsure. Claudia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oops," she said. Then, in one smooth, deliberate motion, She tilted the tray and dumped the entire meal into Zara's lap. The chicken slid onto her jeans, the vegetables tumbled down her legs, the sauce splashed across her shirt, and the pie landed face down against her stomach. The tray clattered to the floor. The butter dish rolled down the aisle like a silent witness. Zara gasped, but no sound followed. Her body tensed, frozen in place, soaked now in food as well as shame. Claudia looked down at the mess she'd made, hands on her hips. "We don't serve fine meals to social experiments," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "If you're hungry, maybe you should have eaten before boarding someone else's life." A gasp echoed from 2 rows up. Someone whispered, "Did she just say that?" Another voice murmured, "This is too far," but no one stood. No one helped. No one stopped it. Claudia kicked the empty tray lightly with a shoe, then smiled again. "You can clean that up when you're done soaking in it." She turned and walked away. Zara sat there covered in warm food and cold stares, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Her hands hovered uselessly over her lap, unsure where to begin, wipe the sauce from her shirt or scrape the pie from her legs. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Her breath came in shallow, stuttering gasps as her brain raced to keep up with what her body had just endured. The smell of gravy mixed with orange juice clung to her like another layer of shame. The tray still lay on the floor. The butter dish had stopped spinning. From the galley, Claudia laughed at something another attendant said, her voice casual and unbothered, as if she hadn't just emptied a hot meal onto a child's lap. Zara remained a statue, broken only by the trembling of her bottom lip. She looked down at herself and didn't recognize the girl sitting there. She wasn't Zara anymore. She wasn't a student or a daughter or a passenger. She was just an object, something people pushed around, spilled things on, humiliated for sport. She wanted to cry. Her body begged her to, but the tears wouldn't come. They had dried up, burned out. All that remained now was the taste of defeat. She reached for the napkin again, not the one Claudia threw, but a new one on the untouched meal tray of the empty seat beside her. She pulled it slowly, careful not to make noise, and began to dab at her shirt. It did nothing. The stain remained, and so did the silence. The napkin she had used to clean herself now lay torn on the tray, useless and damp, and her eyes stared forward blankly at the unmoving seat in front of her, trying not to exist, trying not to breathe too loud. She could hear Claudia's laughter from first class, mixing with the metallic clink of cutlery and the warm chatter of people who didn't know or didn't care what she had just endured. It was then that Zara pressed the small gray button above her head, the call light for assistance. It lit up with a soft ping, a quiet beacon asking for basic decency. She waited. 30 seconds passed. A minute. No one came. The light stayed on, a glowing symbol of a request that would not be answered. She pressed it again. Nothing. Further up the aisle, Grace glanced toward the back, saw the light blinking, then quickly looked away. Claudia had already seen it. She turned slowly to the junior attendant and said, "Ignore it." Grace hesitated. "She might need," I said. "Ignore it," Claudia snapped. "If she needs something, she can wait until the rest of the paying passengers are taken care of." She turned to the rest of the crew in the galley and added, "No one goes near that row unless it's an emergency. We're not rewarding bad behavior." One of the older stewards gave a half-hearted nod. No one argued. Claudia's voice carried weight. She was lead crew. She had the authority. In the back, the light kept blinking. Zara blinked with it. She wasn't expecting kindness anymore. But she thought, maybe, just maybe, someone would offer her a tissue. A word. A glance that wasn't full of disgust. Instead, she watched as crew members passed her row, eyes forward, ignoring the blinking light like it was never there. A passenger seated across the aisle reached into his carry-on and pulled out a small pack of tissues. He made eye contact with Zara, who didn't speak but gave the faintest nod. He extended the pack across the aisle. "Here," he said gently. "Take this." Before Zara could reach for it, Claudia appeared beside them like a thunderclap. "Sir," she said sharply, "please return that to your bag." The man blinked. "She's just..." "Now," Claudia said, her voice like ice. Passenger interference with crew policy can result in removal from future flights. I'm sure you don't want to be blacklisted from the airline." The word blacklist landed like a slap. The man looked stunned. Slowly, he retracted his hand. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. Claudia turned back to Zara, stared down at her with cold detachment. "Don't beg," she said softly. "It's pathetic." Zara didn't respond. Her throat had tightened too much to speak. Her hands retreated into her lap, and she curled further into her seat, pressing her body into the corner where the wall met the window, as far from the aisle as she could get. Claudia addressed the row out loud now. "Any passenger who attempts to interfere with crew instructions will be reported and banned from future boarding privileges," she said in a tone of fake politeness. "Thank you for your cooperation." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Zara alone again, sealed in a space designed not for safety or transport, but for quiet punishment. Grace passed the road 10 minutes later with a cart of snacks. She hesitated again as she reached the back, her hand brushing one of the granola bars. Her lips moved like she was about to say something, but Claudia's glare from 3 rows up cut into her spine. Grace turned away and kept rolling the cart. Zara's stomach growled softly, but she didn't bother asking. Not anymore. The seatbelt sign chimed again as the plane hit mild turbulence. Around her, passengers tightened their straps, shifted in their chairs. She didn't move. She didn't care. In her pocket, her phone buzzed silently. Another message from her father. But she didn't reach for it. Not yet. Not while they still had power over her. Not while she was still nothing in their eyes. Claudia passed once more before lights dimmed for nighttime mode. She looked down and muttered, "Learn your place. This world doesn't owe you a thing." The ache of hunger was nothing compared to the deeper hollowness eating away at her sense of self. She had stopped pressing the call button long ago. She knew better now. In this plane, silence was safer than asking. Compliance was safer than hope. From the front of the cabin, Claudia's voice rang out again, falsely cheerful, thanking passengers for choosing the airline, asking if anyone needed assistance. Her tone was sugar-sweet, but behind her eyes, the same cruelty still simmered, carefully masked for the passengers who mattered. Zara didn't lift her head when she heard the footsteps returning. Claudia appeared beside her row again, a plastic smile on her face, a small cup in one hand, condensation glistening along its sides. "I thought you might be thirsty," she said too loudly, loud enough for the passengers nearby to hear, for the phones that were probably still recording to pick up. Zara didn't move. Claudia waited a beat, then slowly leaned forward, her hand hovering near the girl's head. And then, as if by accident, but clearly by design, her grip on the cup slipped. A splash of ice water cascaded down Zara's scalp, drenching her braided hair, rolling down the back of her neck, soaking into the collar of her shirt. The shock of cold hit her like a slap. Her head jerked instinctively. The water streamed into her lap, chilling her already stained clothes. A collective gasp rose from 3 rows nearby. Someone muttered, "What the hell?" under their breath. Claudia straightened as if surprised. "Oh no," she said flatly. "I'm so clumsy." She didn't bend to help, didn't offer a towel, didn't apologize. Instead, she stood over Zara's seat, looking down with feigned pity and a twist of satisfaction in her smirk. Zara's hands rose slowly to her head, her fingers trembling as she tried to wipe the water from her scalp. The cold stung her skin, but it was the heat behind her eyes that threatened to break her. She blinked rapidly, unable to stop the shaking. A single word fell from her lips, barely audible. "Why?" Claudia's head tilted. "Excuse me." Zara's voice cracked. I just wanted to go to school." Her sentence was nothing but a plea, a fragment of innocence clawing to surface in a sea of shame. "That's all I ever wanted. I just wanted to go to school." Claudia's face darkened. The mask slipped for a moment, revealing the contempt beneath. She leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper. "Kids like you don't belong in places like this," she hissed. "You don't get scholarships. You get warnings. You don't go to school. You go under stairs. You hide in basements. You scrub things. That's your lane. Learn it. Zara's mouth fell open slightly, stunned not by the insult itself, but by how easily, how effortlessly it had been said, as if it were truth, as if Claudia had been waiting to say it all along. A hand rose from a row across the aisle, a woman, white mid-40s, visibly shaking with rage. "This is abuse," she said aloud. "That's a child, and you're torturing her." Claudia turned sharply. "I suggest you mind your own seat, ma'am." The woman didn't back down. "No, I won't. I've been watching this for over an hour. You dumped food on her, now you dump water. She's freezing. She's crying. What is wrong with you?" Claudia smirked. "If you'd like to file a complaint, I can provide a form once we land. Until then, stay in your row, or I'll report you for interfering with crew operations." The woman looked around, as if begging the other passengers to say something, to stand. But their eyes dropped, their mouths closed, and the silence returned. Claudia turned back to Zara. "Tidy yourself up," she snapped. "You're a disgrace." Then she turned and strode away, back to her territory, back to the part of the plane where the air was warmer, the lights brighter, and the passengers easier to please. Zara didn't move. Her hands remained in her lap. Her face stared blankly at the seat ahead, her soaked braids dripping water onto her knees. Her lips mouthed words no one heard. Not prayers, not curses, just fragments of thoughts trying to keep her mind from falling apart. "I just wanted to go to school." Zara sat drenched, humiliated, and shivering in the back row of the aircraft, her head bowed beneath the weight of shame, and cold water trickling from her braids down the curve of her spine. The warmth of the plane's artificial air had vanished from her skin, replaced by a deep, gnawing chill that settled inside her bones. Her lips trembled not from the temperature, but from the final unraveling of whatever strength she had clung to through hours of quiet suffering. Around her, silence reigned once more. The woman who had spoken up sat defeated, ignored, eyes fixed forward like the rest. Claudia was back in first class, laughing softly with the man in Zara's original seat, her tone bright, cheerful, as if the back of the plane did not exist. Zara's hands clutched her knees. Her fingertips were red from the cold, and her nails pressed into her skin. Her chest rose in short, shaky breaths. For hours she had endured. For hours she had told herself it would stop, that someone would intervene, that if she just stayed quiet, just kept her head down, it would pass. But it hadn't passed, and no one had come. And now, finally, the tears came in waves. They streamed down her cheeks, hot and fast, dripping into her lap and mixing with the mess already staining her clothes. Her breath caught in her throat as a sob escaped, loud, uncontrollable. She didn't care who heard anymore. Her entire body trembled. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I didn't do anything wrong," over and over again, like a prayer or a plea. Her hands fumbled for her phone buried deep in her backpack. She yanked it free, her fingers slippery with tears, and unlocked the screen through blurred vision. Her thumb hovered over a contact labeled Dad. With one last breath, she hit FaceTime. The phone rang once, twice. Then the screen shifted. Her father's face filled the display, Victor Bennett, sharply dressed in a gray tailored suit, seated behind a mahogany desk with skyline windows glowing behind him. His eyes, dark and focused, instantly narrowed as he saw her face. "Zara," he said, his voice low, controlled, deadly calm. She couldn't speak at first. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Then, in a voice so small it barely registered, she whispered, "Daddy," and her breath hitched. Victor's jaw tightened. "What happened?" he asked, leaning closer to the camera. Zara tried to speak, but broke into a sob. "I'm scared," she cried. "I don't know what I did wrong. I just asked for a cup of orange juice." Her shoulders shook as she cried harder, the pain of hours finally flooding out. "All I did was ask for orange juice." Victor's face darkened. "Zara," he said, "look at me." She raised her eyes to the screen. "Where are you?" he asked. "What seat?" "The last row," she sobbed. "She dumped food on me. She said I didn't belong here. They hate me." "Daddy." Victor turned away from the screen for a second, spoke quickly to someone off camera. Then he turned back, eyes sharp as steel. "I want you to hand this phone to the flight attendant who touched you." Zara blinked. Claudia, she whispered. Give her the phone, Victor said. Right now. His voice was so calm it was terrifying. Zara hesitated, then slowly lifted the phone above the seat divider, hand shaking, and said with barely a voice, "Ma'am, my dad wants to speak with you." Claudia, standing 3 rows up, turned with visible annoyance. "What is it now?" she snapped. "I'm not." Then she saw the screen. Her words died in her throat. On the display, Victor Bennett stared directly into the camera. His voice was flat, precise. "Are you the one who poured food and water onto my daughter?" Claudia blinked. I didn't." "Your name," Victor interrupted, "is Claudia Harper. You are lead flight attendant on Flight 217, New York to London, currently cruising at 32,000 feet. Claudia swallowed hard. Her confidence flickered. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No," Victor said. "There's no misunderstanding. You have exactly 10 seconds to get the captain on this call. If you fail, I will ground this aircraft mid-flight, and you will never step foot on another commercial plane again. Do you understand me?" The color drained from Claudia's face. All around, passengers were turning. People whispered. Phones lifted. Video recording apps opened. "Yes, sir, I don't think you understand who." Victor leaned closer to the camera. "No, Claudia. You don't understand who I am." He held up his own badge toward the camera, a sleek black card with a gold crest of Bennett International Airlines. "I am Victor Charles Bennett," he said, "CEO, owner, founder. And you just assaulted my daughter on my plane." Claudia took a step back. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her legs wobbled slightly. "Get the captain." Victor's voice dropped to a whisper. "Now." Claudia turned and bolted toward the cockpit. In the silence that followed, Zara stared at the screen. Her father's face softened for the first time since the call started. "You're safe now, baby," he said quietly. "I see you. I hear you. And I'm going to fix this." Claudia stumbled away from Zara's row, her pulse pounding in her ears, her grip tightening around the phone, still buzzing in her hand as if it might explode. The moment Victor Bennett's face vanished from the screen, she turned sharply, heart racing, panic creeping beneath her skin like frost. But instead of showing fear, she straightened her shoulders, drew in a sharp breath, and stormed toward the galley with practiced indignation. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. "So now we're taking calls from spoiled little liars who fake a few tears to get their way?" The junior attendant Grace followed behind cautiously, visibly shaken. "He said he was the CEO." Claudia scoffed. "Oh, please. Anyone can say that. It's just a power move. He's bluffing." "He wasn't bluffing," a voice said from the cockpit entrance. Claudia turned. The captain, tall, broad-shouldered, and stone-faced, stepped into the aisle with clipped strides, flanked by the flight manager and 2 senior crew members. His voice was firm and carried the weight of command. "Claudia Harper, stand down from all duties immediately." The entire galley froze. Passengers in nearby rows perked up. Heads turned. Claudia blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. "Excuse me." The captain didn't repeat himself. "Hand over your badge. Step away from passenger areas. You are officially relieved of command pending disciplinary action." "Are you serious right now?" she asked, forcing a half laugh. "This is based on what? Some FaceTime call from a kid with a wild imagination." The captain's gaze didn't waver. "That kid is the daughter of Victor Bennett, and he's authorized a level 2 in-flight override." Claudia's breath caught in her throat. "That's not possible," she whispered. "No one has override authority over flight crew, except the owner of the airline," the captain interrupted. "And he has just invoked it." A ripple spread through the cabin. People stood from their seats. Phones rose again. Whispering turned to murmuring, then to open gasps. Claudia tried to recover, lifting her chin. "You don't understand. She caused problems from the beginning. She was disruptive. I was following protocol." "You dumped food on a 13-year-old, the captain snapped. "You poured water on her head in front of witnesses. You verbally degraded her. All of it was recorded. We've received multiple videos from passengers. Your actions are not defensible." Claudia's face flushed red, but not from embarrassment, rage. This is ridiculous. What about my years of service? What about context? You're really going to believe a child over a trained professional? This airline, the captain said clearly, turning so passengers could hear, does not tolerate abuse, discrimination, or cruelty. Not from passengers, and certainly not from our staff. Claudia looked around, searching for an ally, but the faces she met were hard, cold, disappointed. Even her own crew stood back from her. This is a mistake, she tried again, voice faltering. You can't just strip me of my authority mid-flight, actually. A new voice chimed in, deep and commanding. A screen above the galley lit up, FaceTime again. Victor Bennett's face reappeared, patched through the captain's tablet, and now displayed publicly for the front rows to see. It's not a mistake, he said, and it's not negotiable. Claudia stared at the screen, jaw clenched. This is harassment, she snapped. I'm being set up. Victor leaned forward. Claudia Harper, he said evenly. Your badge ID is 47619. You've been reported twice before for guest misconduct, both covered internally. I've reviewed those records personally. I now consider this your third and final strike. Claudia's mouth opened, but no sound came. Effective immediately, Victor continued. You are terminated from employment at Bennett Airlines and banned from accessing any of our aircraft, lounges, or affiliate services. Your credentials will be digitally revoked the moment this flight lands. Gasps echoed down the aisle. The captain didn't flinch. He turned to his team. Escort MS Harper to the jump seat at the rear of the aircraft. She is to have no further contact with any passengers. Claudia's breath came in short bursts, her face pale. You can't do this, she whispered, but the words held no power now. Grace stepped forward, hand shaking slightly, and took the badge from Claudia's collar. The metal clasp clicked softly as it came undone. Claudia's arms fell to her sides. The same passengers who had once ignored Zara now watched, some with satisfaction, some with somber silence, as justice unfolded before them. The captain raised the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Some of you may have witnessed a distressing incident earlier in the flight involving one of our younger passengers. I want to assure you that the matter has been addressed at the highest level. The individual responsible has been relieved of duty and removed from service. Our focus now is ensuring the rest of your journey is safe and comfortable. Thank you for your patience. Claudia stood frozen as Grace and another attendant gently guided her down the aisle, past the passengers she had once commanded with scorn, past the eyes that now followed her with quiet judgment, past Zara, still curled in her seat, but now clutching the phone in her hand like a lifeline. Claudia didn't look at her. She couldn't. She stared at the floor. She walked slowly, one step at a time, toward the rear, where she would sit, powerless, stripped, and invisible, the way she had made Zara feel. In the cockpit, the captain reached for the comms again and activated the direct line to corporate operations. Flight 217 requesting authorization for controlled delay on landing. Owner has requested in-flight disciplinary hold for compliance review. The reply was quick. Authorized. Full support granted. Across the aircraft, murmurs gave way to applause, tentative at first, then growing louder. One by one, passengers stood, clapping not just for the action, but for the shift they had just witnessed. A girl stood up against cruelty. A father stood up for justice. And an entire cabin, once silent, now stood in recognition of what had happened. The plane descended through soft gray clouds, its nose tilting downward in a smooth arc as the city lights of London flickered into view below. Inside the cabin, there was an unmistakable shift in atmosphere, not one of routine landing announcements and idle chatter, but something taut, expectant, charged. Zara sat still in the final row, the seatbelt fastened across her lap, her shirt still stained, her braids still damp, but her eyes no longer dull. They burned now with something clear, awake, unshakable. Her fingers clutched her phone gently in her lap. The call with her father long ended, but the weight of his voice still wrapped around her like a protective shield. Claudia hadn't said a word since she was removed from duty and forced into the jump seat behind the galley. The confidence in her step, had dissolved. Her name badge was gone. Her hands lay limp in her lap, cuffed not yet by law, but by consequences that had finally found her midair. As the plane touched down, the wheels bumping against the tarmac with a controlled jolt, a quiet ripple moved through the rows. Whispers exchanged looks. Phones clutched tighter. Some passengers had cried silently during the final leg of the flight. Others had sat stone-faced, unsure what to say, what to do. But all had seen what happened, and all had witnessed it end. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice rang through the intercom, calm and deliberate. Welcome to London Heathrow. We ask that you remain seated as we conduct a special procedure per executive directive. Thank you for your cooperation. There was no applause this time, no celebration, only stillness. Outside the window, blue lights flashed near the terminal. 2 black vehicles and a Metropolitan Police cruiser waited at the gate. The jet bridge connected. The seatbelt sign flicked off. No one stood. 2 uniformed officers boarded first, followed by a man in a black coat and corporate lanyard, head of international operations for Bennett Airlines. He walked with purpose to the back of the plane. When he reached Claudia, who now looked like a shell of her former self, he spoke 4 simple words. You need to come. Her eyes darted briefly to Zara, then quickly away. She rose slowly, hands trembling, and followed the officers toward the exit. Before stepping off, she paused once at the threshold, hoping, perhaps, that someone would stop it, say it was all a mistake, offer her a lifeline. No one did. A camera flash went off. Someone captured the moment her silhouette disappeared through the door. At the front of the plane, Victor Bennett stood waiting. He had flown in on a corporate jet the moment Zara called. Now he stood near the gate, his coat immaculate, his presence powerful. When the officers led Claudia down the ramp in cuffs, he didn't flinch. He simply watched. She passed him without a word. He turned and boarded the commercial aircraft. The entire front cabin fell into silence as he walked through. Passengers whispered his name. Phones recorded his stride. He didn't stop until he reached the back of the plane. There, in the last row, his daughter waited, still small, still silent, still clutching the phone that had saved her. Zara, he said, his voice catching for just a moment. She looked up. For the first time that day, she smiled, a tiny, exhausted curve of her lips. He knelt in front of her, wrapping her in his arms. The smell of food, sweat, salt, and cold water clung to her clothes. But he didn't let go. Not for a second. I'm so sorry, he whispered into her hair. They'll never touch you again. She didn't cry. Not this time. She buried her face in his chest and closed her eyes. When they exited the plane, security formed a discreet corridor, not to shield her from attention, but to protect her from the weight of the world watching. Cameras lined the terminal. Reporters had already begun piecing together the story from passenger posts online, but nothing could compare to what came next. In the hours following the landing, the video of Zara's FaceTime call with her father exploded across social media platforms. The hashtag #OrangeJustice trended globally. News anchors replayed her broken voice, I just wanted a cup of orange juice, and Victor's chilling line, give the phone to the person who just assaulted my daughter. Think pieces were written. Protests were sparked. Policies were re-examined. Claudia Harper was formally charged with abuse of a minor, assault, and racially motivated misconduct. Internal investigations uncovered past complaints buried under procedural red tape. She was sentenced not only in court, but in public memory. Her name became synonymous with unchecked power, and her face, a symbol of what happens when cruelty meets consequence. Zara didn't return to school the next day, or the next. But when she did, she walked into that building with her head high. Students stood when she passed. Teachers offered nods of quiet respect. And in the front lobby, a framed article now hung on the wall. Daughter of Airline CEO fights back with a single call. Underneath it in black lettering, a quote from her father. Courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's just holding the line until justice lands. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful true story dramatizations. Which part of Zara's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the orange juice, the public humiliation, or the moment her father revealed who he was? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from right now? We love seeing our community grow across the globe. Justice took flight in this story. Let's make sure it keeps flying.